This is very humbling for me to be here today, Mark.
Why is that?
It seems that BDE set a record for most downloads in a week, and it's actually download numbers rivaling Chuck Yates Needs a Job. And I was not here last week. I was not part of BDE.
You were off on, do you have a PSA related to your absence?
World Women's Poker Tournament in Vegas. So
why don't we, any recap or interesting
what stays in Vegas happens in Vegas.
Right.
I will say this to some degree. You know how NAPE, the Vibe at NAPE, tracks the price of oil.
Yeah.
You know, the industry kind of felt healthier out in Vegas. They had record turnout for the tournament this year. Vibe was really good. So
$85 TI will do that.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will.
And you got back when?
I got back Friday night.
Yeah.
And it took a little while to recover.
Completely unresponsive.
Yeah, no.
To show prep.
To show
direction.
prep. You asked for a phone call this weekend, and I didn't call you, and I'm sorry about that. But I was a little worn out.
I think people were tuning in thinking maybe this is the genesis of where is Chuck Yates?
Ooh, there we go. That'd actually be a fun podcast.
So what's going on today? Anything of note?
The Eclipse. Did you see the thing I tweeted out yesterday? I stole this from someplace, and I wish I could give credit. I'm going to go fill a bunch of blow-up women with helium and let them go when the eclipse absent. Says this is the rapture.
I just got a pretty funny eclipse video meme that I can't share, but I was looking last night. I have family in the Hill Country area, and right around Fredericksburg, Comfort, Bernie, Kerrville area is prime watching. In fact, my elderly father has been on the local citizen community response committee meetings for the last
where to
couple
set
of
up
weeks.
The chairs. Yeah.
Right. And how to secure your property. But I went on Expedia yesterday and was just looking around for hotels that I'm familiar with. And occasionally I'll stay in one down in Bernie, which is a few miles down the road. But I call it a Hamptons Plus. So this is not 5-star resort.
Right.
Guess what? A one-night stay at the Doubletree Bevy Hotel in Bernie would cost you last night.
I'm going to say $299, and that is shockingly high in my mind.
$1,300.
No way.
I checked back last night for availability. All those hotels were sold out.
You know what's crazy is Airbnb published the direct line of the Eclipse and all their Airbnbs in there, and it's at 92% occupancy.
That's
in the
great.
Direct line.
Almost Houston's totality of 94%, which we can't see, by the way, because we have a double thick cloud dome over the entire Houston area today.
My whole thing is they say this stuff happens like once every 200 years, but it feels like about every 3 years.
Well, the last one was in 2017.
Yeah.
I was talking to John earlier this morning and had picked up some news snippets. Of course, most of the media, mainstream media, is focused on these, we take it to the silly extremes about all the other pop culture stuff going on around it. There's, these eclipse weddings and, stuff that might make a good next episode of Chuck Yates Needs a Job.
Perfect.
But one of the interesting stats, and it's not funny, in fact, it's tragic, is that because of the obvious rush of people to certain areas to observe the eclipse, I think the stat was from 2017 event, and there weren't nearly as many densely populated areas. Like I think the biggest cities on the total eclipse path are Cleveland and Buffalo, but there was something like 10 traffic fatalities per hour during the kind of the relevant period of the eclipse viewing. So
I remember in 17 you had to fly somewhere, basically, as I recall. When we researched how do we do this, take the kids out of school, it was You got to go fly someplace.
It's cutting a pretty direct swath through the central part of Texas and up through the northwest part of the state on up into the northeast. Anyway, so what else happened today?
You tell me, because this is totally your jam. I think you stumped me with it. To be fair, this morning.
Yeah, today is the 50th anniversary of Hank Aaron breaking Babe Ruth's home run record. He hit number 715 at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. And another interesting piece of baseball trivia, at least it is to me, Tom House was in the bullpen, and he caught the 715th home run and greeted Aaron at the plate after the game was over with. And I have vague recollections of it when it happened. And I think the most famous footage from that is Aaron's rounding the bases, and between shortstop and third base, these two knucklehead fans flank him on either side. And if you really think about what was going on leading up to that, he was receiving death threats and just all kinds of hate.
And so bad racial time, black man.
Here's a couple of obviously drunk, long-haired looking dudes. One I think was in a leather suede jacket, and you can see him gently kind of elbow those guys off of him. But can't imagine just the whole psychological and emotional pressure of that moment. It took him a while, I think. I don't remember the complete sequence leading up to that, but it was early in the season, obviously, because there was a chance he could have done it the season before. We used to open Major League Baseball baseball season in early April, and now it's, kind of pushed earlier into March. In fact, they opened the season with a 2-game series in Seoul, Korea with the Dodgers and the Padres this year. So, what else happened on April the 8th?
One other thing about that, and I hate to do this, I grew up Houston Astros fan as young, and the announcer was Milo Hamilton, was the Astros announcer. He came from Atlanta. He called that for the I think Atlanta radio, or it may have been TV. I can't remember.
I think Vin Scully was doing the TV,
and then Hamilton was doing the worst call ever. He talked all the way through that moment. Anyway, but kudos to Hank Aaron. Amazing baseball player.
So what else happened on April the 8th? This is your jam.
Okay, audience. I'll let you in on this. I just Googled what happened on it. We had all obscure popes that were excommunicated and this and that. But Venus de Milo, the famous sculpture in the Louvre in France, was discovered in 1820. And the secret thing there is supposedly it's not that great a piece of sculpture, but the Louvre really needed something to sell. So they promoted the hell out of that thing as if it was the greatest find ever. Marketing versus true art, I think.
Good. What's our first item?
Let's do this. Doomberg did a piece on the nuclear facility. Jump into that, and then we'll tie our buddies at Diamondback into that story.
Yeah, it was a piece week before last called "The Last Palisades," which is in reference to the shut down nuclear facility in Michigan that is now designated for restart. And really, the heart of the article gets to the inertia that is inherently in the system when it comes to approvals of technology and permitting and approval of new nuclear facilities. If you think back to mid-'70s to mid-'90s in a 20-year period, France was able to build and bring online, I think, something on the order of 65 gigawatts of the equivalent was stated in number of Palisades facilities. I think it was the equivalent of 75 Palisades nuclear facilities. The other interesting comparative is that Palisades has generated a cumulative energy equivalent to all of the solar capacity in the U.S. combined has generated today. But getting back to the NRC as being that rampart, I guess, of delay, inertia, there's been a political shift where I didn't notice this, but President Biden had nominated a new commissioner and then quietly withdrew that commissioner's nomination. The background of that commissioner, I think his last name was Baran, Baran, was Sierra Club, et cetera. And so I started looking into the NRC. Don't pay much attention to the NRC commissioner's makeup. Only one of the four has any engineering background, which, given the technical challenges and the risks and things that we want to evaluate in terms of the body that makes rulings and is the final authority on certainly new nuclear technology, it sparked a thought that we had some experience in oil field operations with a group called the High Reliability Group. Bob Kuntz founded that, and he was a former 20-year nuclear submarine veteran. And I can tell you just from that experience that you think of the kind of the risk of being subsea within arm's length of a nuclear reactor, the engineering, the safety protocols, the risk management, the operating, the tightness of the operating procedures, those are quite applicable to high risk and hazardous operations. And so my thought was, well, seems like that would make a good, really, foundation or philosophy for those that are making decisions on deploying nuclear technology if there is a resumption of growth and adopting new technology like SMRs, which we're getting ready to talk about, where you have a track record in the nuclear Navy that spans, I think we talked about it a little bit last week in a preview, essentially 6,000 reactor years of accident-free operation. Seems like the
ocean's much rougher than potentially thunderstorms and stuff, and you're being shot at by German subs potentially, et cetera, Russian subs. I mean, you got to be prepared for everything there. And the fact we can't look at that and say, you know what, I'm pretty sure we can make this safe is just ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because the nuclear power is both on the surface and more hazardously below the surface. And you're traversing the globe. We don't know where, we don't know for how long. I was really compelled by the exposure limits, the federal exposure limit for radiation workers. I don't know the units, but the nuclear Navy has turned in a cumulative of 1/1000th of that. And you think about proximity to the nuclear reactor on a sub or on a ship, seems to me they know what they're doing.
Yeah, like way safer than an X-ray technician working in a doctor's office, I bet.
And it, as we think about SMRs, what is the prime mover on a nuclear sub or an aircraft carrier? It is, I guess, essentially an SMR.
Right.
And so we've seen some things pop up in the headlines around the adoption of nuclear and oil and gas.
Tracy tweeted out the Bloomberg article last week that Diamondback had signed a letter of intent with, I think it's Oklo, to how to pronounce it, for development of, they're targeting a 15 megawatt reactor to use out in the oil field. And if you think about it, I mean, West Texas, Permian Basin, the Texas grid is out there, but it's not the most reliable. You have the small municipality type grid electric systems you have to hook into, co-op type stuff. And so, I mean, this is an ideal application for that. I have heard from a friend that was talking to Mark Andreessen, And I love bringing up his name. Mark Buddy, old pal, as we go back to my direct messaging him on Twitter that he's never responded to. But Mark publicly says that that's eventually how we're going to run all the data centers is micro nuclear type stuff. And we're just going to build it inside of big cement blocks or big concrete blocks. And then if something happens, the door's shut and boom, that's it. So there's no external type damages done. So it's just crazy to me. We say this all the time on BDE. If we invented nuclear today, we'd be talking about we solved climate change.
Right.
And it's just the baggage. I mean, yes, we've had some accidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, but the damage done there has been minimal.
And if you think about Japan having a major event within the last, I think it was 2011 when the tsunami did the damage to Fukushima, you're now, because of their energy security, restarting facilities in Japan. So they're back on a path to more adoption of nuclear energy as a solution as, uncertainty surrounding things like natural gas imports and being really an island of virtually no natural resources, at least in terms of hydrocarbons, is, I think is a somewhat urgent reality as you think about the next few decades of where the power is going to come from. And I'm sure Japan is as impacted as anywhere else in the world in terms of the demand growth related to things like AI and high-end computing.
And I'll say this, the biggest thing I took away when we broke down all the European countries and power usage, power demands, and where they were getting their energy from, et cetera, the biggest shocker to me was France had built all the nuclear, and I knew that. I mean, everybody kind of knows they'd gone all in nuclear in the 70s, but I didn't recognize that they were importing as much of a third of what they were producing on any given day to Germany, Great Britain. Guess what? Germany got to build all the renewables they got to build. Britain got to build renewables because of that baseload power sitting there in France. And so if solar and wind people really want to have a long-term presence as part of the grid, being part of the solution, I mean, it may be the bastard cousin, but they need to make friends with nuclear, because that's having that baseload dispatchable power, potentially, even in a backup capacity, is essential for renewables, because they're just not going to do it without it.
Right.
Or we're always going to be burning hydrocarbons.
Well, I think the other push is we've seen early signs of, most notably in Amazon and its data center with the nuclear option, is going to be the kind of the juggernaut behind turning the tide on getting back on a track to growing nuclear.
So I've got scheduled towards the end of this month, or if he comes to Houston for my parents' 60th wedding anniversary.
Impressive.
We're having a big party for them on May 18th, and Zane may come into it. But Zane Ball has had standing as the fifth Yates brother historically, because we all met at Rice. He works at Intel, and he's now in charge of data power, or power for data systems centers. He watches BDE. He's going to come on Chuck Job, and we're going to deep dive all that stuff. So it'd be interesting to hear what he says. All right. Is U.S. oil production going up or down, Mark? What say you?
Don't know. I last week, Gehring and Rosenzweig published as part of their investor communication in their blog on U.S. oil production, basically challenging the notion that U.S. oil production grew 1 million barrels a day. The philosophy, or the basis, fundamentally is we're not going to avoid essentially what has happened in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford. Once high grading is done, et cetera, you got big surges that are notable. Quite a fair bit of high grading going on, particularly during stress periods in the down cycles over the last 10, 15 years. But just to level set here, the EIA showed year over year for all of 2023, about 1 million barrels a day of growth. We've talked about that, surprises to the upside. Their adjustments suggest, GNR's adjustments suggest that it was likely only 600,000 barrels a day in 23. And so they look at the endpoints of January, or the entry point to 23 of January. Year over year growth was about 1.4 million barrels a day. By December, their estimate is we were down to 311,000 barrels a day. And furthermore, that there could be signs of a plateauing showing up in the adjusted numbers as early as right now. So March, April of 24. So year over year growth, they contend is slowing. The culprits in the EIA data, or the errors that they believe that are in the EIA data, are primarily related to what's happened to what's called the adjustment factor, which there's a nifty little graph in their piece. And if we can post that, you can see a long-term trend from 1981 when the adjustment factor came into being through about mid-teens. The real step up actually didn't occur until 2018. And this was tens of thousands of barrels a day to, long-term peak of, I'd say 200 or 300,000 barrels a day. Well, July of last year, it had spiked to 840,000 barrels a day. And
that's almost 10% of U.S. production.
Yeah, on the margin, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
so
right. It's a big freaking number.
Two factors in the middle of that is there has been always a chronic underreporting in field level production because the IA collects its data from more aggregated points. And then two, they've started breaking out, and it made an immediate, I think, 50% reduction in the adjustment factor, what they called crude transfers. I think of them as blending components that come from the refinery back to the field and then find their way back into the refinery. So you're essentially, the way I think about recycling barrels and double counting those barrels. So the net of all that is, when you make those adjustments, and they've done a lot of their own sophisticated neural network modeling on well performance prediction and analysis. They're quite on the other end of the spectrum of answering that question in the affirmative. So looking for an evidence sign of Permian, which has constituted most or U.S. shales, primarily the Permian, have constituted most of the global non-OPEC growth wedge over the last few years. That sets up a pretty different set of fundamentals as it relates to keeping an eye on stock draws as we move in further into the year. So if it is happening, it's going to show up in steeper than expected inventory draws.
Yeah, three things came to mind when I was reading this. And I've said this, Ted Cross and I talked about this on Chuck Job. If you look back from kind of 2016 to 2018, well, let's go back to call it 2010. 2010 to 2016, individual well productivity was up 40% each year. And that was all better horizontals, better completion technology, et cetera, right? And in 16 and to 18, it was up, call it 20% a year. So people were talking about it plateauing. What was really interesting, though, if you peeled it out, is if you took Exxon and Chevron wells out of 2016 to 2018 drilling, individual wells were down kind of 3 to 5% each year, meaning the growth in all the wells going up was because Chevron and Exxon were late to drilling horizontals, and they had the best rock in the Permian. So they're showing up with the best technology, the best rock, and that's what kept it going. So the peak in technology was, call it 2015, 2016. Now, stuff's gotten better. I don't mean to dismiss that, but the big, huge ramps. Another thing that I found pretty interesting is if you look at kind of like 08 to 2016, this big, huge ramp of growth. If you took US, Saudi, and Russia production out of the mix, and that was, what's that? Call it a third of world oil production. You take that out of the mix, the remaining 2/3 oil production during that time was actually down like 1%. And you had $130 oil in the middle of that. So you had every incentive on the planet. So whatever, the rest of the world could not add barrels during that period. And then kind of the final thing I'll throw in that I think stews into this is 2020, we have a pandemic. We shut in stuff. And a lot of those shut-ins were the United States because we're the marginal barrel. And, you know, worldwide production in 2019 was what, 100 million barrels a day, something like that. And we only produced 88 million barrels a day in 2020. So let's say we were down 10 to 15%. We turned that stuff back on. There was some pressure built up. So we kind of had a pop, at least some of that. And you're the reservoir engineer. Tell me, the dumb finance guy, if I'm wrong. But turning that stuff back on, you kind of felt artificially high as well. I'm throwing all this stuff out here because you basically drilled down on the Permian and said it's plateauing. I'm sitting here going, the whole rest of the world is more of the same. So if we are heading to a cliff, it's a big fucking cliff.
Well, if you're not, you know, in periods where you pull hard back on the capital budget, you tend to find creative things to do under the expense budget.
Yeah.
Like workovers, production optimization, things like that. Golden screwdriver is what we used to call it.
Yeah.
And so, and Conoco, back in the mid-teens, when, you know, immediately on the heels of the OPEC Thanksgiving surprise, I remember going to their investor day in New York and Ryan Lance talking about the backlog of what I would call golden screwdriver projects. I didn't think it had the life or the duration on it that it does, but that stuff that happens below the waterline can certainly create that. You know, shutting in wells, I think we've generally agree from a reservoir technical perspective doesn't hurt them. So the fact that production came back after the COVID dip and temporary shut-in period.
Scariest thing Mike Hines ever said to me. We were sitting there shutting in all those wells, and Mike goes, you know, theoretically it shouldn't hurt. It should come back. But, you know, we don't know that. We haven't tried that on a massive scale. We haven't tried that with these big, huge fracs we've done. And he goes, I'm sure they're going to come back and this is the right thing to do, but we don't know that.
So we talked about this a few weeks ago, this very same subject. And, you know, over the long history, large, high quality, high porosity, high permeability, conventional reservoirs tend to nothing but benefit from, I don't like the term resting period. When you talk about ultra tight rock and stuff at a micro and nano scale in terms of flow capacity, permeability, or flow potential, then, you know, who knows what happens in specific areas relative to changing the things like relative permeability dynamics.
Yeah.
So if we have somebody who is in the process of writing a book on that, we'd love to hear from you.
Because it was crazy. With Grenadier, we had Appalachia Basin stuff doing the Marcellus, and we, you know, generally the thesis was you get in there, you drill horizontal, massive frac, produce the water off as quick as possible, get it off formation. We went in, did that. Something happened, and we weren't able to produce the well back for like 90 to 120 days. And it wound up being the best well we ever had. And we produced back 25%, 35% of the frac fluid. And that became our standard operating practice. Drill, frac, wait 90 days before turning it on. And it increased, 25, 30% well productivity. But we didn't know that going in.
At Prudhoe, we had this thing called MER, maximum efficient rate. Prudhoe is a big world-class, high-quality, right, from a geologic standpoint, reservoir or series of reservoirs. And the two major problems, part of the field was depletion drive or gas cap expansion. Part of it was water drive and a lot of in-between stuff too. But we always thought about, the real risk of how you manage your production shut-in versus pulling too hard on them was always about, we don't want to pull too hard because you create this, either a gas cone when the gas cap gets closer to your producing interval, your perforations, you can create a bit of what we used to call a smearing effect. And that ultimately makes the oil inaccessible. So you're doing way more damage by pulling on those types of wells too hard than you are by shutting them in.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe benefiting. And we had workover programs where we're trying to move perforated intervals around to get further away from the problem fluid, whether it was water or gas. So
interesting. Although anytime I start believing, this time it's it.
One point on this whole debate, if there is a debate, Doomberg did put out a piece, I think back in December, maybe early January, called Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth. They think the march of a very high capability oil and gas technical workforce, technology, et cetera, over the very long run is going to continue to translate into global hydrocarbon production growth. And at least specific to the Permian and unconventionals in the U.S., GNR are talking about just a natural end of high grading and plateau and then decline. Adam Rosenzweig of Gehring and Rosenzweig and Doomberg did an interesting debate pod on thoughtful money, which is worth going to take a look at if you haven't.
Art Berman was on the other side of that too, saying that, and I tried to get Art to come on the podcast and we just missed, but maybe go back to. I've thought actually a lot about this because we've talked about a lot of this on BDE, and my position on all of this is set politics, set rock, set technology kind of aside, and that's not really the focus of thinking through this. It's tell me what the price of oil is.
Right.
If it's 150, we're going to find a lot more of it because of all the aforementioned thing. And if it's at 50, we're just not.
We're not running out of oil. We're running out of oil at a certain price.
Exactly. And we have tighter feedback loops today because of shale. And so I'm kind of in
social media.
Yeah, I'm in Doomberg's camp on it, so long as you give me the price incentive to do it. So, all right, let's do this real quick. Let's do these rapid fire because then I got something not on the list that we forgot to talk about that we have to. Shell Scope 3 appeal. What's the great update there?
There's a hearing for the appeal that. In response to a lawsuit from a group that is opposed to Shell ratcheting back on its Scope 3 emissions reduction targets. There's a pretty substantial difference between the adjusted Shell targets and where they believe they need to go. It's in front of a court in The Hague. And if the appeal, and the appeal's obviously made by Shell, if the appeal is rejected, then it affects Shell's worldwide operations. It's not just in the Netherlands. So it's being heard in the Netherlands in an international court. A decision on the appeal arguments are going to be made, I think, over 4 days in the second half of April. And the decision is likely to come down sometime in the second half of the year. If this is, if it's upheld and Shell has to pivot and go to much more aggressive emissions reductions targets by 2030, 95% of Shell's operational emissions or emissions related to its business are Scope 3 related. So that gets into the very ambiguous and slippery slope of doing things to mitigate emissions ultimately produced by people who are using your product. And we've had this discussion before. And I've mentioned in the past that the European domiciled majors are under much more scrutiny as it relates to governmental and social pressures to do these things. But it's also, I think, the reason that Exxon was not pushed into adopting a Scope 3 target. And this was back during the Engine 1 activist campaign that got 2 or 3 of their nominees on the board. So,
by the way, Exxon board member Andy Karsner, who was one of their
let me guess, he went to Rice.
He went to Rice. He was one of the board nominees that wound up winning. Happy birthday, Andy! It was Andy's birthday 3 days ago.
So just something to keep an eye on for the coming months. But it's an adverse ruling is going to.
Yeah, I still think, and maybe I'm being a little Pollyanna here, I still think Scope 3 is going to help ultimately energy companies, despite what Shell's going through. It is going to highlight the fact of, hey guys, it's the Amazon vans running around being delivered to your house 3 times a day that's doing this, not the fact that I'm running, I've reduced methane emissions X% over the last, so.
Which is, a great fit for things like repeat route, high frequency route, deployment of EVs.
Yeah.
Or EV technology and delivery vans and inside the fence of industrial facilities where there's a lot of distance traveled in vehicles that run the same route. I'm interested in a company that does inductive type charging, and there's a lot of potential there in the market.
Yeah. Gotcha. Let's hit the Permian pipeline stuff.
I just saw
the FERC filings because God knows we got to be able to get gas out of the Permian.
Yeah, with Waha trading at I think minus 220.
Yeah.
Amalgamated Sludge posted in response to I think a question that was related to his operation in New Mexico. And he said, I think for 2 days this year, Waha's traded positive, and that was at 9 cents an M. TPH had an infrastructure update this morning and just talked about some FERC filings that they saw last week. There's a proposal in with the FERC for a wet gas pipeline that would evacuate gas from the Permian to essentially Hackberry in Louisiana. And that's notable because it's the first of its kind. So let's take the wet gas stream, move it to processing and export centers on the Gulf Coast, as opposed to building these complex and expensive processing plants in the Permian, of which there are a few. But there's a group called Moss Lake Partners. Moss Lake is the terminus, essentially, of this proposed pipeline in Louisiana near Hackberry. And really twofold in that you've got obviously growing NGL exports, but you also have the LNG situation, export situation really centered there. And so you've got one way, which is to process the gas in the region or in the basin, and then you got to do something with the NGLs. There are Y-grade NGL pipelines that transport down here to Houston Ship, for example. But I just thought it was notable that we're now talking about building, I think it's a 2 BCF a day pipeline. Will have 5 laterals, and I think 8 compressor stations. But just the notion of it being the first of, and we know the significant bulk, if not virtually all, of Permian gas that's coming with oil production is pretty rich.
Yeah. So the thing we didn't put on the run of show that we have to talk about just real quick. Somebody running for Senate in New Jersey, I think. It's made it to The View. I think AOC has tweeted it out that climate change caused the earthquake in New York. Seriously?
Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me, but I did like somebody's response with, okay, well, we need to shut New York down till we study it and find out what caused it. But how ridiculous is that?
Yeah, I think there were some political commentators out there predicting this ahead of other, there might even be some that would correlate the eclipse with climate change. I would equate it to the fact that there's this cloud dome over Houston today and we can't see it.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something there.
Yeah, just absolutely ridiculous. But like we've been doing each week on BDE, we've been talking about an election. This is the year of the election. Potentially billions of people are voting. We had an election April 4th last week, so Kuwait. And the punchline from the Kuwait parliament elections is nothing really changed. But I did study Kuwait a little bit and their government, and I found this interesting. Since they have so much in the way of resources, maybe we'll spend a minute on it. You have the emir. That's the royal family. And the emir, which was established in the 1962 Constitution, gets to appoint the prime minister. And the prime minister appoints a cabinet. The emir also appoints all the judges, and most of the judges are actually Egyptian nationals that have been brought over to be judges. Then you have the National Assembly, which has 50 members. That's parliament. And they're actually popularly elected. So the opposition party in this election retained 29 out of the 50 seats, which was kind of status quo from the beginning. Only 11 people lost their seats. And so it's kind of status quo. But it was interesting reading about the Kuwaiti government and how it got set up. The royal family, in effect, owns the minerals, owns the oil. The merchant class, in effect, had a veto over policies of the emir by, well, we'll just leave, dude. We don't have to be here. And they both figured out getting together, we need to provide healthcare, education, participation, i.e. direct employment, direct elections to the people. And so that's actually how they balanced the government. So Kuwait's one of the more liberal governments in the Middle East.
I mean, it's a monarchy with a constitution that I think was created in 1962.
Yeah.
Every prime minister appointee by the emir is connected by blood to the royal family. And what I could tell, there's, quite a bit of, call it free speech and civil disobedience and discourse that's tolerated. You can criticize the government. You've got universal voting rights. You've got a number of other things. But I don't know if amused is the right word. There seems to be a pretty high frequency of just dissolving parliament, whatever.
Just because. Yeah.
just because.
Yeah,
So,
just because.
but it's a system that's worked pretty well. It's created one of the more progressive examples in the region. And so I think that as we think about the landscape of change politically in parts of the world and countries that don't practice our form of representative republic democracy and have our kind of legacy of rebellion starting with the American Revolution, I just think it's interesting to see within the context of their own sovereign situation what works well in relative to some other surrounding nations in the region that have much more problematic politics and conflict. Kuwait's a pretty good example of political stability.
So my favorite teacher I've ever had in my life, Gilbert Cuthbertson, Doc C, when we went to Monterrey, Mexico, because he would always take a group of us students down through Mexico, Guatemala, all that. When we were in the city of Monterrey, he said, and Doc was partially deaf, so he talked funny. And Doc's like, the city of Monterey, the highway system and the street system is just like life. Constitution, good. Revolution, bad. And so there you go. Hey,
all right.
We enjoyed having everybody. Sorry we missed Kirk and Colin. No gratuitous prostate joke on either one of them. We played it straight. It was much more fun talking about
We're going to get Kirk to report back from his absence. He's going to have a pretty interesting week.
He's having a good time. If you like the show, please pass it to a friend. Give us some comments. Hopefully you didn't miss Colin and Kirk too much. If you actually liked it better, please say that as well. See you next week.